Our final episode opens up with a view of the new Mordor. The ash and gas have all settled, and the land looks in some ways similar to what we see in The Lord of the Rings, though the great Tower of Barad-dûr is still not yet finished. A great horn is blown in the north, and all the orcs and some of the men have looks of fear and excitement upon their faces as they rush to the Valley of Udun. There, they and the council greet with the proper pomp and circumstance the arrival of Elendil, the glow of his body gone and some of the finer, more obtrusively flattering characteristics repressed for a harder, more commanding form. "My lord Sauron," one of the counselors says, "the preparations are almost complete. You must forgive us, for we had not expected you to come so soon. We presume that all went well with you?" Sauron smiles. "Yes, very well indeed." His voice should be one of great power, though not necessarily deep, violent, or expressed merely in the amplitude of the sound. I couldn't think of a good way to do it within the context of this video, so use your imagination. "Though we will have to work quickly. The elves will likely soon be alerted to our presence here, but I believe I have created a way to remove them as a threat." "Where is that elf, the one my orcs call Adar?" The other counselors smile. "We are afraid he cannot be with us any longer, but we will no doubt explain more fully once you have been able to rest from your long journey within your tower." "Very well." Sauron then turns to the orcs. His voice, though not spoken very loudly, seems to echo across the entire valley. "My servants, you all have work to do before we are ready for the fight that is coming. This land is to be turned into the great fortress of our new empire, the Empire of the Orc. Go now, and ready the forges, for when we have struck our blow, you shall be free of the tyranny of men." The orcs cheer at this. "Dwarves," another cheer. "And most of all, the elves." The loudest cheer of all. The orcs continue to cheer until they disperse as Sauron is led back to his tower. As this happens, one of the counselors seems to notice something in the distance, but is recalled by Sauron and draws his attention away from it. A panning shot over the entire land shows the tunnels, trenches, forges, towers, bridges, and all sorts of war machines being built as the camera moves back west over the mountains, and we get a good look of just how far the ash has extended over the South Anduin Valley until we see Arondir and his companions returning to the fortress of Eminarnen. They ride into the fortress and are greeted solemnly by the elves and men there. Arondir requests to be taken to Isilmo and Valandil. They are brought into the citadel, and Isilmo rises hopefully upon seeing Arondir, but is quickly taken by despair when he notices the look of apologetic sorrow on Arondir's face. Arondir first comes to Isilmo and bows. "My lord, I am afraid I have failed you completely. I can offer no justification besides my own lack of skill in finding a pass into the land to the east. I'm sorry." Isilmo does not respond, fighting to keep tears from welling up in his eyes. Instead, he simply leaves the room to retreat into his chambers. "What's going to happen to us?" one of the men in the room says. Arondir looks around and notices that no one seems confused by the question. "Everything was explained to us," one of the other men says. "Lord Gath believed that now that the traitors were revealed and the sword gone, it would be safe for most of us to know what was taken and why." "I see," Arondir says. "Thankfully, it appears that nothing shall happen for the time being." Everyone looks confused at this. "Did you not all feel the earthquakes? They happened only a week or so ago." "We did," Valandil says, eyes still bandaged, though there are no longer any bloodstains. "But since nothing came of it, we assumed it was merely natural." "I'm afraid not, my lord. The sword of which I spoke was used to create permanent darkness over Mordor, and spread that darkness throughout the surrounding lands. I do not expect that we should be able to stay here any longer. We must retreat further across the river and seek a new place to hold out. And, if I may be so bold, Lord Valandil, despite your loss and my failure, I beg that you do not abandon us to our fate in this land, for if you do, we shall surely be conquered." Valandil nods. "You do not need to worry about whether we shall uphold our vows to you, my friend. The people of Numenor do not easily abandon allies, assuming they have not been betrayed. The men who have done this to us have either been punished or killed. We must now seek vengeance against the orcs." He stands. "Still, the few of us here cannot withstand the onslaught you say is coming. My cousin and I shall have to go back to Numenor and seek reinforcements. Indeed, I doubt the Queen will be able to tolerate non-intervention once she sees the loss of her nephew and the state of our party." He walks out of the room. Shortly afterwards, Lord Gatham Bronwyn entered the room. "My Lord Arondir, I heard you have returned. We have a dire report. As I'm sure you must have seen, there are black clouds coming from Mordor." "What has happened?" Arondir, somehow coming to an even greater understanding of what has happened, turns to the Lords of the Valley and says, "My lords, I am sorry. I have lost." He sulks away, back bent and eyes fixed firmly on the ground. After leaving, Gath looks around and sees that everyone is now looking to him. His face bears a grim expression, but he hides that for a moment, and his more stoic temperament reasserts itself. Clearly our commander is overwhelmed for the moment, but this is no time for us to follow him. Let us retreat and reestablish ourselves to fight another day. He leaves the room with Bronwyn. The camera then pans north, and we see that Glorfindel has already made his way back to the Falls of Rauros. He looks south with disturbed urgency at the sight of the new ash and black clouds looming over the hills of Mordor. He quickly crosses the river, the light within him almost constantly visible at this point, and makes his way over the paths of Emenmuil. We then see a great forest, in which is a path on which rides a large group of elves on horseback, being led by Elrond and Gil-galad. They are mostly silent save for the sounds of the horse hooves on the earth and stone, with the ambient sounds of the forest during late springtime bustling about them. Still, it is clear from their faces that their minds are not idle. Indeed, they all seem to be in the middle of some horrible thought process, for their faces are grim. Eventually, however, Elrond awakens from his thoughts and turns to the High King. "Have you come any closer to an answer to this riddle, High King?" "I am afraid not, my friend," Gil-galad responds. "It is clear that this Anatar was making some form of preparation, intending both to deceive us himself and prevent us from learning the will of the Valar. If only we could find the true envoy they have sent." "I have been wondering," Elrond says, "whether this Elendil was even truly an elf, or if he were a spirit of higher power. That is indeed a possibility we cannot dismiss. It is as Galadriel said, something was different about him. He had power over the hearts and minds of elves in a way that not even she could match." He ponders his own words for a moment before stopping the group and turning to look back at the misty mountains. "Gildor, when was the last time we have received news from our distant brethren in the south?" "I believe that would be 2 years ago, High King," Gildor says. "They mentioned vague reports of growing towns, house squabbles between rising noble families, and a growing number of orc raids." Gil-galad nods and turns to continue going back to Lindon. "I do not know exactly what this Lord of Gifts has been planning, but it is now clear to me that we have spent far too much time attempting to secure Eriador." They come around the bend of the hill and we see the Blue Mountains and the outskirts of Lindon in the distance. "I now have no doubt that he has been building power in the east or south, somewhere out of our reach." Elrond nods in agreement. "Galadriel's decision, it seems, was a wise one, though I fear what evil Celeborn's stubbornness may cause. We shall have to deal with that when the problem arises. For now, I'm afraid we shall have to make preparations for war." We then go to a shot of Celebrimbor and Narvi approaching the throne of Durin with Galadriel and Celebrian behind them. Out of courtesy, Narvi insists that the two ladies go before them in their request. Galadriel accepts this courtesy and presents herself to King Durin. She is bedecked with traveling clothes which are humble, though by no means impoverished in color and style. Still, being Galadriel, she wears them with unblemished grace, elegance, and elvish beauty, such that a man, or in this case a dwarf, would hardly have been able to notice. Having only heard her speak among elves the entire season, we are, in this scene, confronted with the unbridled brilliance of her voice when it is spoken in the slightly less couth, though by no means ignoble, halls of the dwarves. "King Durin," she begins while doing a reverent curtsy. "I want to say first of all that I have no part in any disputes you have had with members of my kingdom, and, indeed, am as much a victim of them as you have been. It is in light of this that I must ask for safe passage to the other side of your realm, to meet the elves who live in the land of Lorinund." The king rises from his throne and begins to move towards his petitioner. As he does so, he speaks fairly softly compared to what we are used to. "Could you be more specific about your intention in the lands to the east? You are familiar with the great enemy, are you not? The one destroyed long ago by Ale and his companions?" "Indeed." "I am." Durin continues approaching her. "I have reason to believe that, though we may be free of his wickedness, not all traces of him have been banished from Middle-earth. There are lingering followers of the great enemy, and one of these has posed as an envoy from the Valar. Indeed, from Aule in particular. Durin looks at Narvi and Celebrimbor behind her. I see. I would like to warn the elves to the east. They deserve to know what is coming. King Durin then arrives in front of Galadriel. The two of them stand for a few moments as Galadriel demonstrates her intentions to him with the casual confidence of her face. The king bows low before her. My lady, you and your companion shall have leave to go through the roads of my kingdom for as long as I am king. Go now with my blessing. Galadriel smiles graciously and bows to the king, placing a kiss of gratitude upon his forehead and calling to her entourage. As they leave, Narvi and Celebrimbor look to each other hopefully and move to approach the king. They have several carts with them, and once more Celebrimbor bows low before Durin. King Durin, your son and I have discovered that there is a great opportunity for a new venture between our people. In light of our recent mistakes, I would like once more to apologize on behalf of all the Noldor and Eregion. Furthermore, as a peace offering and in hopes that trade may once more be open between our peoples, I have brought forth our customary settlement. The king raises an eyebrow. Already? I am impressed by your courtesy. Celebrimbor acknowledges the statement only mildly before continuing. I have brought with me 3,000 bushels of wheat from our fields, 2,000 barrels of wine, marked according to our recognized custom, as well as a third of the produce of our vineyards and gardens for this summer. Finally, I have heard among your people that material for clothes and furniture are greatly needed from beyond the mountains. Therefore, as a show of goodwill, I have brought twice our normally agreed quantity in such resources. I ask only, as before, that we be allowed to continue trade, especially with the metals of mithril and gold, which have so mutually enriched our peoples. The king looks at the food, clothes, and other goods with the look of fascinated temptation. Narvi and Celebrimbor look to each other with a smile and a nod. The king, however, looks as though a strange hesitance has come over him. No. He pauses, and then, as if scrambling for an excuse, he continues, It is clear to me that we can no longer give away so valuable a resource as mithril. Celebrimbor is in shock. Narvi, however, bursts out in anger. Father, what madness is this? You know well that this is by far the greatest trade we have ever made. The elves are being more than generous with us, being free with necessities while we are miserly with metals. Do you not see that you've been overtaken by a strange greed, that before I gave you that ring you were far more Enough! The king shouts, his voice echoing through the halls. For a time everyone is silent, and the surrounding dwarves look at him in fear. Guards, the king continues, escort this elf out of my realm. He is banished. What? Narvi roars in response. I will talk to you later, the king says to Narvi. While he says this, several dwarvish guards approach Celebrimbor apprehensively, ready to draw their weapons in case the elf does something. Instead, Celebrimbor simply bows to the king and signals to his elvish companions to retake the goods. We then cut to a shot of the large valley leading up to the fortress we saw in episode 1. The fortress appears very different, repaired, and even somewhat decorated, with the beginnings of a town outside of it. We then see Varix on horseback, with the rest of his entourage, ring in hand, with a look which mixes sorrow, frustration, resolution, and even a bit of hope. The rest of the men and women with him appear worried, but are also too afraid to say anything, and give off the impression that this was an extremely silent ride home. Varix does, however, speak up as they continue down the slope into the valley. Did I make the right decision? The servants look at each other, with Eirik being the only one willing to answer. Ultimately, my king, I do not believe that is for us to decide. Varix turns to him and smiles slightly, meaning that it is for me to decide whether or not I have done well? Eirik tries to fight his own smile. No, I mean that we never got the chance to learn ethics from the elves. Varix chuckles grimly. Indeed. He looks back to the fortress. It seems there is much we could have learned had we stayed. Eirik does not respond, so eventually Varix continues. I suppose there's no use regretting the past. Besides, with this, he holds up the ring, we shall truly be able to fulfill the High King's desire for us. Eirik looks as though he's about to say something, but refrains from doing so. Instead, Varix begins to laugh excitedly, and everyone around him looks confused. What is it, my king? One of the other servants says. Don't you all understand? Our war is over. We have a realm of our own, and now I have the power to prevent any invasion of orcs till the world ends. We've won. I've secured our kingdom's freedom forever. Slowly, it seems to dawn on everyone just what all this means, and a look of hope kindles in their faces. Apart from Eric, who still appears solemn as they make their way to the fortress. We then see a shot of Marigold in her imprisonment, being taken further and further east by a group of Easterling men. She is strangely humming a tune of happy idlement as they take her along the way, clearly to the annoyance of her captors. They motion for her to stop, but she persists. One of them, a calm, collected soldier, moves over and slaps her across the face. She stops humming for a second in shock at the slap, but then begins to hum again. Immediately, the soldier slaps her again and says something to the other soldiers. They begin marching again, and the calm soldier walks next to the soldier dragging Marigold's chains. After what appears to be a few minutes, Marigold begins humming again, and the soldier slaps her once more. After a few more minutes, she repeats the process. "Why do you do this?" one of her fellow captives says to her. "I find it helps me keep my mind cheerful," she replies, and begins to hum her tune once again. The guard strikes her once more. "Besides," she whispers back after being struck, "they'll barely notice the mumbling of your friends while paying attention to me." She hums again, and the man looks around and notices that several of his companions are communicating discreetly to each other, not solely by whispers, but also by signs, which the disguise of the humming renders invisible to the Easterlings. The captured man is surprised to see this, but nods. He looks around and is happy to see that several of his companions seem to be already in the middle of forging a plan. Marigold is once more struck, this time more severely, to the point that blood is drawn, but she continues to hum her tune, and even seems to increase in volume. The soldier waits a few moments and slaps her again, this time even more harshly. Marigold has no reaction. At long last, the soldier seems to have grown frustrated. He takes her by the shoulder and turns her body towards his, making motion to pummel her to the ground. Before he can do this, however, his hand is caught by a fellow soldier. Marigold starts, more shocked by this than she was by the blows, and watches as the two soldiers begin arguing. Not letting the opportunity slip, several of the other prisoners begin speaking to each other more quickly, and Marigold catches wind of their plan. Suddenly, however, the marching stops, and the two soldiers cease arguing. It is clear that the soldier who stopped Marigold's abuser is of some higher command, for he seems to order the other away. It is at this point that the sun sets, and a camp is set up. The friendly Easterling looks at Marigold. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Marigold says nothing, but stares at him with a questioning glance. The Easterling commander, after waiting for her response, says nothing. He then brings the chieftain of her fellow prisoners to him as well, and begins talking to both of them. "I'll grant that humming is annoying, and that it drew away some of the attention, but did you really think that no one was watching your fellow prisoners?" He turns to the chieftain. "I will admit that I admire your resilience, but you lack any real sense of secrecy." Marigold still makes no response. Neither does the chieftain. The Easterling commander rolls his eyes and grabs them by the shoulders, roughly taking them out of the light of the fires now that the sun is set. "Pretending as though you don't understand me is useless. I and others have already heard you using the same language." Marigold, whether out of stubbornness or lacking anything to say, continues her silence. The Easterling seems to be considering something before turning to the chieftain and speaking in a language that Marigold does not understand. The chieftain responds somewhat haltingly, but the Easterling seems satisfied. He brings them close to a tent, though they remain shrouded in darkness, and they hear people arguing within. To Marigold, this all means nothing, but the chieftain seems to understand and become horror-struck. He turns to Marigold and says, "He's not lying, little girl," but then says to the Easterling, "Why do you tell me this? What could you hope to gain from helping us in this way?" The Easterling smiles. "I have no more love for any of this cruelty. No part of my clan does." He turns to Marigold. "The High Chief Khamul is luring that elf into a trap. You are the centerpiece of that trap." Marigold's eyes widen and she finally responds. "What's he going to do?" "The High Chief has received some help from an evil creature, which has granted him the ability to... well... I'll admit I don't know precisely what he can do. From what I know, he has already tested them on this elf and been satisfied with them. Once the elf comes, there will be no undoing things for him, which was why I must get you all to safety first." Marigold stares at him dumbfounded for a moment, but only a moment. After that is over, her face hardens with determination. "How can I help?" The Easterling gives the chieftain and her a cloak. "I have obtained permission to grant you all cloaks and blankets. We are in the middle of winter after all. And tonight my men will supply you all with weapons. There are 12 of us." He designates each of them in a subtle way so as not to arouse suspicion. "I and 2 of my men have the watch tonight. We will kill the other watchers, free you from your bonds, and then, when I give the signal, you will help us destroy the camp." He then turns to Marigold. "You are the one the elf seems to value most, based on what the High Chief says." A shameful blush spreads across the Harfoot's face. Furthermore, he has paid far more attention to you than you realize. I've already received the impression from him that you are hard-headed, foolhardy, short-sighted, and driven by impulse rather than thought. Marigold's blush deepens. Therefore, I advise you to escape and find him if you can. It is possible that the Easterling meant no offense by the words, but his tone was that of a straightforward man used to command. Marigold seems annoyed by this, but nods, very hesitantly. In our next scene, we see Valandil and Isilmo sailing west. The Númenórean ship is silent, though it is clear that the voyage has been ongoing for at least several days at this point. Valandil is sitting below deck, while Isilmo seems to be doing all that he can to keep himself from confronting the loss of his son. Eventually, however, he goes down below deck to where Valandil is laying. At first, Isilmo believes his cousin to be asleep before Valandil says, "Is that you?" Isilmo frowns. "Yes. How are you dealing with your loss?" "I could justly ask you the same question," Isilmo says. Valandil sits up from the bed. "I'm not going to start an argument about this. If you would like to save discussing it for some other time, I will be happy to do so." Isilmo's frown deepens, but the rest of his face softens. There's a long pause as Valandil, his eyes no longer bandaged, stares in the direction of his cousin with two gaping holes in his face, a look which is especially disturbing in the low light. Still, Isilmo eventually moves over and sits next to him, taking no account of the awful sight. "I cannot talk," he says after making a motion to say something. His eyes begin to glisten as he holds back the welling tears. "Cousin, my mind has finally numbed from the pain, and it has done so only because I have commanded all who are on this ship to remain silent. Even now, with the mere suggestion of loss on your lips, I can already feel the pain returning. That dark, despairing abyss which hitherto I had never felt. No, I cannot talk about this. Not now, and I fear not ever. I do not believe that will be possible. The Queen will expect a full report, and I do not know how I shall spin the tale of how I lost my eyes without mentioning the loss of your son. If you do not wish to talk now, we may save it for later in the voyage, but based on how long we've been at sea, I do not think we have much voyage left." Isilmo closes his eyes and attempts to relax unsuccessfully as he takes a long, deep breath. Valandil senses something in his cousin. "I see that you are not only grieving, but also troubled. Why?" Isilmo shakes his head. Then, in a falsely calm voice, he says, "How is one supposed to deal with the loss of his only son? And what will this mean for the future of Númenor? How is one to continue living knowing that you could have prevented his death if you only turned around and went home? You and I both know that was not an option. Even Minister came to see that in the end." Isilmo shakes his head. "That was always an option, cousin. We saved thousands of men and elves by our expedition. They shall die all the same, now that a dark power once more grows in the east. Even if we do prevail against them, what are their lives in comparison with my son?" He immediately shows regret for having said these words out loud, and at last his sorrow overtakes his face. At first, Valandil says nothing. Eventually, he puts his hand on his cousin's shoulder. "Do you remember my mother?" Isilmo looks up. "Yes. Why?" "I remember very little of her. I have no image of her within the court, or in any of her fine dresses at the festivals in Armenelas, or part in the Meneltarma. No. I only remember her as she was when I laid upon her lap as a child, and when she lay dying of sickness." Isilmo bows his head. Valandil continues. "What always struck me as most strange is that her face showed the opposite expression of what you would expect. While she played with me and my siblings, she looked troubled, as if constantly worried about the future, suffering in both mind and body. But when she laid on her bed, her body suffering immense pain, she had the face of one wholly content, bright with joy and full of love and hope shining upon all who entered her room." Isilmo says nothing. "One day, I don't remember if this was before or after she became sick, for I cannot remember her face as she said this. She asked me if I had done my duty to my tutors, as well as to your side of the family." Here Valandil's smile widens. I do not know the reason, but I was feeling rather mischievous that day, for instead of answering her, I asked, "Why should I?" She replied that life is all about fulfilling duties, for it is only in service to others that one obtains happiness. Again, Isilmo says nothing. I did not know what to say, for it seemed to me that her service to others had brought no happiness to her life. Eventually I asked if she had lived in service to others. "I have certainly tried," she said. Thinking I had won, I retorted that her life brought her nothing but sorrow. Valandil pauses as Isilmo continues to listen. I can still feel the smile on her face when I said that, Isilmo. Her face is gone, but the warm embrace of her smile is there. Do you know what she told me? She said, "My dearest son, don't you understand? Sorrow and joy do not exclude each other. It is only through sorrow that one can obtain joy that is eternal, and know that one has gotten it." Valandil stops speaking, and Isilmo continues to stare at him. Eventually he looks away, tears still streaming from his eyes. He closes them and shakes his head. "I cannot imagine the sorrow ever becoming joy." Valandil nods. "Neither can I. But her words have rung out in my head ever since. I do not know if this is true, but I think they are the reason I have tried to become a better man all these years." There is once again a pause as the two cousins seem to be content to listen to the waves and the creaking of the hull. Eventually, Isilmo stands up, and Valandil does so as well. "Valandil," Isilmo says, helping his cousin to the stairs. He hesitates to continue. You have always been a much better man than I, and throughout the years, you have only continued to advance far ahead of me." Valandil waits for his cousin to continue, but Isilmo says nothing. The two of them begin walking up the stairs. After coming up on deck, they find the crew just as silent as before, each man attending to his own thoughts. This silence lasts a while as Valandil appreciates the feel of the wind in his hair and the smell of the sea in his nostrils, and eventually we hear a general sigh of relief arise among the crew, and we see that they are looking with excitement towards the west. Isilmo looks as well, and we see the top of a mountain coming in the distance. "Valandil," Isilmo says, "we're almost home. Oh, I never tire to see Meneltarma's sacred peak through the grey mists of the morning." He then stops himself and once more turns to his cousin, frowning. He leans over and speaks softly to him. "I know how insufficient it would be, but perhaps would you like me to describe him to you?" Valandil smiles. "There is no need." He stands up and moves towards the front of the boat, cloth now once again covering where his eyes used to be. "I can see him just as clearly as you." Celebrimbor is in the process of leaving Moria. While doing so, Narvi enters the room and Celebrimbor turns to say his farewells. To his surprise, however, the dwarf seems to be in no mood for goodbyes. He walks up to Celebrimbor and paces. My friend," Celebrimbor says. "I'm not going to stand for this," the dwarf says, still pacing. "My father may be the king, but it is clear that he has let his desire for gold ruin his desire to serve the dwarves of Khazad-dûm. What are you saying?" Narvi looks at his friend and smiles. "The king demands loyalty and respect from his people by right," he says. As he is speaking, we see another group of dwarves run up and bow to Narvi, but he cannot expect them to obey so long as he is unjust. Celebrimbor looks horrified at the implication. "Narvi, you elves are too scrupulous," the dwarf interrupts. "Don't pretend as though you've forgotten what's at stake. You think that false messenger will stop with the damage done to a random tribe of men in a kingdom of dwarves? You think he'll suddenly stop his mischief with what he's done so far?" Celebrimbor does not respond. Narvi comes close to him. "Mark my words, Celebrimbor. Unless you create newer, better weapons than those rings, there will be no hope of winning in the end, let alone of restoring what is lost. Isn't that what you elves have been trying to do all this time? What do you hope to do?" "We," Narvi says, looking at his dwarvish companions, "are going to raid the vaults." The six of them begin sneaking throughout the city, making their way to the treasury with no one noticing them. Narvi attempts to enter through a side doorway, but they are found out shortly after entering and captured. The guards bring them to the dungeons, and while they are being brought, Narvi begins speaking in Sindarin. They share a few words of mutual encouragement, somewhat similar to what we see in the mining scene towards the end of the show, before Narvi reveals that he managed to snag some mithril and gold. He and his companion dwarves then attack the guards, and Narvi kicks Celebrimbor away, telling him to get out of Khazad-dûm as quickly as possible. Narvi is imprisoned. Durin, after a little bit of a montage, comes to his son in his prison. A look of disgust and disappointment overshadows anything else on his face. Why? Why would you steal from your own father? Narvi does not answer. Son, I am in no mood for this. Please, talk to me. Narvi looks at his father, stands up, and walks over to the bars. Father, throughout all my life I have served you, both as a son and as a subject. And I have always believed that you were one of the strongest and most generous dwarves in the world. But ever since you let your suspicion of my friends fester within your heart, you have fallen. I already made my worst mistake by obeying your wicked command to steal from my friends. And now, his voice rises, you are so consumed by greed that you are willing to banish an elf over an ingot of gold and some myth. That's enough! Durin shouts. The stones throughout the prison ring out in the echo of his voice. You have already gone that far, have you? Very well. You are hereby stripped of all title and inheritance. I condemn you to be accounted the lowest of dwarves. Worse than a thief, you are to be branded a traitor alongside all those you have as accomplice. The dwarvish guard look extremely disturbed by this condemnation, but say nothing. Even Narvi is shocked by the suddenness and violence of his father's words. The king storms out of the dungeon. Nevertheless, we see Celebrimbor making it back to Osten-Deathil and beginning the forging of the new rings. He reaches the guild with a grim face, holding the 3 chunks of metal in hand. As many of his fellow smiths come to talk to him, he rushes past each of them and retreats to the inner forge. Days seem to pass without anyone seeing him, but we occasionally glimpse Celebrimbor at his work. We see great plans, and eventually the preparation of the forges with Tess, and eventually elves coming in and out running errands for him. Then, during the montage, he stops. One of his errand runners comes into the forge and sees him standing in the middle of the room, clearly halfway to his intended destination, as though time had suddenly stopped around him. Celebrimbor looks over to the elf, who acquires a nervous expression. Then, the master smith relaxes and goes over to a chair to sit down. Is everything all right, my lord? Celebrimbor wipes the sweat off of his brow. There's something wrong about all of this. The other elf says nothing. Elendil has already turned some of these rings to evil purpose, merely by giving them to people. I thought that creating new rings without his influence would be all the difference, but now that I come to that task, am I even worthy of this anymore? Are not the rings too dangerous in themselves? If the pursuit of such power has already caused so many issues, how can the pursuit of further power solve them? I have no ability to answer that, my lord. Celebrimbor looks up and, as if only just now recognizing the other elf, laughs with recognition upon seeing him. Still, he shakes his head and continues talking. I wonder if I am not merely playing into his hands. If I create the new rings, am I really creating them apart from his influence? Would it not be better to allow some younger smith, uncorrupted by any knowledge from the false envoy? You would be hard-pressed to find any such smith in the city, my lord. You speak truly. He turns to the other elf before saying, hesitantly, I fear we may have to cancel this project. The other elf looks dejected and bows before leaving. Celebrimbor, however, remains in his seat. The words of his friend continue to haunt him. Unless you create newer, better weapons than those rings, there will be no hope of winning in the end, let alone of restoring what is lost. We can see him struggling with the dilemma for minutes, if not hours, before he sits down and reads through some of his older journals, ostensibly merely to clear his head. He reads through some of the diagrams and descriptions of his older work with Narvi and the other smiths, as well as those of his sires and grandsire. Suddenly, something seems to click. He goes back over his plans and eventually scraps all of them, appearing to return to the basics of smithing. He refires the forges, the other elves notice, and one of the smiths goes to him. Well? The smith asks. We cannot remove the danger of the rings, Celebrimbor begins. But the smith, looking confused, interrupts. Then what's the point of the project going on? Did not you yourself say? You misunderstand. We cannot remove the danger of the rings, certainly not to the user, but what I can do is make them tools of protection, healing, wisdom, preservation, rather than pure power. The smith raises an eyebrow. Celebrimbor continues. Elendil knows only how to contrive naked strength, control, manipulation. But we can do better. We have done better. Virtually all our arts are examples of power stemmed to a given purpose. Even my grandfather, who designed crafts of far greater power than we have, always gave purpose to his creations. He laughs excitedly and even turns from his work. Indeed, how could we have been so blind? Now that I see it, it is obvious. What do you mean? Elendil's task was not merely to have us create rings. Don't you see it now? Do you not remember how before the false messenger, we pursued the arts of light, letters, jewels, and doors? Our interests were as diverse and our skills as broad as they were spectacular. No. Elendil did not come just to stir strife. It came to corrupt our minds away from our ability to create tools of healing, of beauty, of wisdom, of nurture and protection, and to pursue only power. Now, I shall create the greatest tools of healing this world has ever seen. There are dangers with these rings, no doubt. For just as a medicine which cures an elf may kill a man, so too may these rings be perilous to mortals. But they will not be weapons, and as such, they shall prove to be far greater weapons against Elendil than any of the other rings could be. The smith smiles, finally understanding. He bows and moves to leave the room. If you need anything at all, my lord, we would all be pleased to assist you in whatever way we can. Celebrimbor returns to his labors and eventually finalizes his work on the new rings. 3 he creates, 2 of golden rim, 1 of mithril. On the first and most powerful of these, he sets a beautiful rounded sapphire, cut unlike what we see in the show. On the second, he puts a large ruby, and on the mithril ring, he sets a white gem. And all about the room, it seems as though the elements of air, water, and fire shift as he attempts to use each of the new rings. Eventually, he is satisfied with their power and exits the guild to present them to Celeborn. Celeborn seems eminently pleased by the results, especially once Celebrimbor explains their purpose. He immediately turns to one of his messengers and says, "Send a letter to the High King." In our next scene, we return to Marigold in the camp. We see the night has long progressed, as all the preparations for the escape have been made. The friendly Easterling gives the signal, and immediately the captives throughout the camp spring into action. They reveal knives and daggers which have been supplied to them as several members throw off their chains. The friendly Easterling likewise joins the action as the fighting turns into a sort of melee. Marigold, who recognizes herself as no good in a fight without a bow, attempts to help everyone coordinate by keeping herself away from the battle and shouting directions and signals to her companions. Eventually, we see that most of the soldiers who had been restraining the captives have died, and the friendly Easterling has a look of both relief and excitement on his face. Then, suddenly, an arrow goes through his stomach. He looks down in disbelief and falls to the ground. Marigold turns to see that Hamel and his own escort have come back to the sounds of battle and are about to make quick work of the captives. Within moments, many of them are slain, and they move to retreat into the nearby forests. This, however, is thwarted by the sight of wargs cutting off their escape, and immediately the chieftain and his subjects are thrown into despair. Marigold herself nearly gives up on her companions and makes to run when she feels something. She looks up at the sky with a questioning glance, it still being an overcast darkness indicative of night. Then she closes her eyes like one who stares too suddenly at a lamp early in the morning, or at the sun while exiting a cave. She grabs onto her grandmother's amulet and sees that the sun has already risen. The beauty of the morning seems to revive her spirits, and she turns to help her companions. It is then that she sees another sign of hope, for behind the pack of wargs shines a light even more fierce than the rising sun. Glorfindel. He is arrayed in full wrath with drawn sword and the terrible strength of Orome upon his face. He charges forth with a shout like a war horn, and the wargs disperse without resistance. Even the eldest and most fierce among them turn and run like beaten pups away from the battlefield, and far into the east, as if an army of elvish hunters had set their sights on each of them. Hamel and his men, however, take a different line. They begin to spread out, and the illusion of a thick forest and fog descends upon the land. Despite this, it is not long before Glorfindel finds Marigold and rejoices to see her, though his joy is not without sternness. "Glorfindel," she says, both cheerfully and cautiously before suddenly stopping. Her face seems shrouded with dizziness and fatigue. Glorfindel also senses Camel's illusions begin to take effect, prepares to break them for himself. But there is also concern in his eyes, for he now fears that he will have to defend Marigold and the other men in addition to looking after himself. Just as he is ready to break the illusion, however, Marigold pretends to sway a bit before pulling out a knife and throwing it at a tree. An animalistic cry comes from it, and the illusions are broken. The two of them then see Hamel fall off his horse, and Marigold expresses frustration. "Damn," she says. "I thought that would hit his neck." "You can see through the illusions?" Glorfindel says in surprise. "Yep, pretty good, right? Which reminds me, does the world look like night to you right now?" "Yes, why?" Before she can answer, however, Glorfindel notices that Hamel has stood up and drawn his sword. Instantly he is upon the wicked king, but just as quickly his guards block the elves' blows, and Glorfindel is caught in the middle of a battle. He strikes at each with immense speed, but they show surprising skill in holding him off for a time. Eventually, however, each is slain, buying only just enough time for Hamel to gain a decent distance and mount a new horse. Glorfindel chases after the horse. Marigold yells out to him to stop. Glorfindel apologizes, but says that he cannot let the opportunity slip. Marigold runs after him as fast as she can, but to no avail. The horse speeds away, heading towards the trees, but Glorfindel catches up to it. He throws his sword as if it were a spear, and pierces the back of the Easterling. Hamul falls to the ground, the horse still charging away, as his blood soaks into the grass underneath. He lies still, motionless, as Glorfindel walks up to him. The elf breathes a sigh of relief that this stage of his task is now at last done, when once again he hears Marigold's shouts behind him. He looks around in the darkness, making sure that no other Easterling has come, though he seems uncertain whether this is necessary, and goes to Marigold.
"That's not the real one,"
he hears her yelling. He pauses as his mind processes the words. Then, his eyes widen and he turns around, focusing his mind. Once more we hear a sound like the breaking of glass, and the night in the forest disappears. It is now mid-morning, and the body of the Easterling chieftain disappears. Glorfindel sighs in frustration, but relaxes nonetheless. The fiery glow within him subsides, and he returns to his subtler, more ordinary elvish look. He turns to see Marigold still running towards him, and he walks to meet her. When they finally reach each other, Marigold is completely out of breath. The two of them go to the top of the hill, and Marigold immediately starts hypothesizing about all the places he could have gone to get back to the east. Glorfindel expresses just how impressed he is verbally, and makes his declaration that he has decided to change course. Clearly, there's far more going on in the east than he or the Valar were aware of. Therefore, for the time being, he must turn aside from his journey to the Elvish realms to understand and sabotage the efforts of the enemy if he can. He turns to offer Marigold the opportunity to come with him, noting that she will have to learn how to truly survive out in the wild, away from family, friends, and comforts. She accepts. Glorfindel picks her up and begins to sprint into the distance. We then see a group of dwarves approach Narvi in his prison. Narvi seems rather distressed and asks only for news of Celebrimbor. They tell him that the elf escaped without harm, but that the king has cut off all communication with Eregion. Narvi then asks if the Lady Galadriel has been harmed, and they say no, that she made her way through Moria without incident. At last, Narvi seems somewhat relieved by this, but the dwarves insist that they continue talking to him, noting that his imprisonment has raised several eyebrows and caused many suspicions of Durin to flare up. Narvi becomes interested in this, and the dwarves continue by noting that Durin has been acting strangely for weeks now. Narvi frowns at this, knowing the cause, and wondering how many people heard what he said in the throne room. His friends then assure him, Durin is king, it is true. But we fear there is a feud brewing in Khazad-dûm. Don't worry, one of them says. We'll find a way to get you out of this prison. This isn't over. I'll make sure of it. And then in our last scene, we have a shot of an extremely overcast hillside. Indeed, it is so dark it could almost be the middle of a thunderstorm, though there is no rain. In the distance, there is a dense tree line, while in the background we hear uneven footfall until an extremely tired man walks past the camera. His clothes are tattered, and he even has a slight limp, though this is clearly no major hindrance, as he quickly dashes into hiding as soon as he hears a group of orcs approaching the area. He waits until they are gone, and then continues onwards. We then see that his hair is matted with dirt and that he is holding something in his hands, though we cannot see what. He continues onwards and makes his way down a gentle slope until he finally makes it to the forest. He turns around and we see that it is Ministir. In an extremely brief flashback, we see that he managed to incapacitate one of the orcs who was leading him to be sacrificed by pretending to be far weaker than he actually was. And that, after finding a secure place to hide from the orcs, he witnessed the sacrificing of Adar in his place, as well as the eruption of Mount Doom. It seems that now he is free, but there is no hope in his eyes. For as he turns around to look once more at the Ered Lithwi from which he has just climbed down, the camera pans up, and once more we see Mordor with all its pits, trenches, furnaces, camps, and endless fields of ash and smog. Great tribes of orcs have gathered and nearly fill the land, while smaller groups of men, primarily Easterlings, have camps and sections of their own. All the while, the camera zooms towards the erupting mountain, inching closer to the Samath Naur, atop the stairwell chiseled into the side of Araduin. As it approaches, we hear the noise of a great forge, and eventually, when we pierce through the endless smog belching forth from the crack of doom, the sounds of the hammering die down, and all is, for a moment, still and dark. But as the scene brightens, akin to how eyes adjust to new light, we see a great, fair form rise from his work and hold it aloft. The camera continues to brighten as he slips the golden ring onto his finger, and as the fiery words begin to glow brighter and brighter, the camera begins to fade to black, and we hear those dreadful words. Ashnaz Durbatuluk, Ashnaz Gimbatul, Ashnaz Thrakatuluk, Agburzumishi Krimbatu.